That was me for a while. What's happened here is, I think, to their credit, the ADPs and Paychecks and the outside providers of the world have done a terrific job in understanding the law and rejiggering their systems and implementing this and getting it done. So much so that we get very few questions about this. Ditto with respect to the in-house folks in companies that do this internally. It has been a Herculean effort, but I think folks have stepped up. And as a result, yeah, we have some new information on the W-2. Most folks haven't even looked at it. Fair enough. The women's preventative care mandate is a little bit different. There, that is principally access to contraceptive coverage, and of course the people who have objected the most have been both the religious institutions themselves, the churches particularly, and secondarily, the religious colleges, universities, and hospitals. Among our clients are four of the major Jesuit institutions in the country, so we've spent an awful lot of time on these issues. I'm a little troubled by this because I think, in fairness to the administration, and as a rule, I like to keep politics out of this as best I can, but in my view, I thought the administration did a pretty good job at taking that off of their shoulder. What they said with the rules is, look, if you're a Catholic college or university and you don't want to provide content, don't do it. They'll have a carrier provide a separate standalone benefit. You don't have to, they will contact your folks, let them know that benefit's out there. It's no additional charge, and be done with it. There are still lawsuits that are winding their way through the federal system. At the end of the day, this requirement will either stand or not. It is at the margins of the Affordable Care Act. If this provision of the law was found unconstitutional or some other way defective, it wouldn't affect the structure of the Affordable Care Act. I keep referring to that structure. Just let me sidestep this and take a detour. I said at the beginning there are 5 principal features of the Affordable Care Act, and they are the same as 5 principal features that we came up with in Mass. In Mass, in 2006, it was principally the Heritage Foundation, working with Ron Romney administration, that designed many of the key features of our law. And you don't get much more red state conservative than the Heritage Foundation. We run conference calls with them every week. And the 5 key features were this. Number 1, there is a mandate on individuals to have coverage. Number 2, if you are a low-income individual, we'll give you some help. Number 3, there's a state-based exchange or marketplace where you can go look at products, standardized products now, and you can compare apples to apples comparison. There's an employer mandate. So much of healthcare is delivered by employers anyway. And then there's some tax reform, pay for all. Those 5 features are exactly the same features that you see in the federal law. And that's what I mean in response to this gentleman's question. That model is sound given the political reality. By that I mean, the political reality I mean is, the Affordable Care Act didn't throw everything out and start fresh. It took existing market structures. So we still use private sector carriers to provide insurance. We still have coverage to employers, and we still have Medicare, Medicaid, TRICARE, and the government programs. If you look at the $2.6 or so trillion we spend annually on health care, half of that right off the bat is government programs. They've been tinkered with at the margins, but at the end of the day, they're not all that different. We still have Medicare, we recognize it as such. And on the private sector side, we still have the carriers and we still have employers. So that's what the Affordable Care Act is. Its regulatory superstructure addresses those structures. Any change in women's preventative care won't affect that model. There is, by the way, and I'll address this in more detail, there is a set of cases coming up that could blow a major hole in Obamacare. And I'm talking about a below the waterline mistake. The ship sinks. We'll get there. Gotta have something to look at. All right. There's also this thing, I love it. It's called a summaries of benefits and coverage. Folks might have seen it. It's about a 4 double-sided page thing, 8 pages, 9 pages, and it's kind of a chart about what options you have in your health plan. Folks seen these? Oh, I've got to say, I scratched my head over this requirement when I first saw it in the law, but it's pretty good. You can actually understand what you got for a health plan. And you can look at different options if you want to shop them. You can get different descriptions of your options. Again, no major issues. There are limits on medical flexible spending accounts, and that annoyed some folks. It used to be that if you knew you were going to have a major dental surgery, you could put away in your flexible spending account a good amount for the following year to plan for it. Now you're capped at $2,500. There is significant bipartisan support for repealing that and doing something different. However, for purely political reasons, nothing is moving in terms of amendments to the law to those sorts of changes. I'm not going to really get into the details of a lot of that increases on COLA, but basically, from that FSA, it's $2,500 this year, but that number will creep up. There is also some rules about 90-day waiting periods that are going to go in, and these are 2014. So let me stop here for a second. All of the items that I just mentioned, they were sampling of the requirements, some of the requirements that came in 2013, and hey, we're still here. No, nothing earth-shattering. Some of them I think are a big deal, others not, but so far so good. So what happens in 2014? Well, obviously the two that have attracted all of the political attention are the employer mandate that was deferred and the individual mandate, should that be deferred. What troubles me a little bit on the individual mandate is the penalty in the first year is pretty minor. If you don't have coverage, it's about $95. And yet folks want to fight about it. And on both sides. One side, oh, we absolutely have to delay this, it's unfair. And the other side pulling back, no, we can't. Who knows? However, in 2014, God forbid you forget who I am. It's too late. We now have a 90-day waiting period cap. Now, in most industries, particularly in technology, you get covered first day of the month, following day to hire. Sometimes it's right away. It's not a big deal. However, if you're in particularly the restaurant industry, 1 year waiting periods were not uncommon. All right? So that's going to change. So that's another theme I think you'll see that this law affects employers very differently depending on their industry and their sector. The two industries that are the hardest, that pose the biggest challenges to by the Affordable Care Act, staffing/PEOs is number one. And number two, following close behind it, is restaurants. And then behind that, any industry with large numbers of variable contingent workers, retail, franchise, mining, construction, you name it, things like that. Okay, there's also some rules so again, 90-day waiting period. So far, no major questions, some annoyance on the part of restaurant sponsors, but that's about it that we've encountered. There's also some rules about wellness programs, and this to me is one of the real tragedies of federal regulation right now. It would be great if we could really encourage meaningfully wellness, employee wellness. And the Affordable Care Act gestured at that. The trouble is that we've got many agencies of the government that oversee the implementation of wellness. And we've got, for years, our EEOC has had rules that make it impossible or difficult to implement the basic rules that are in the code and risks and the like. And until the government gets that straight, wellness programs will pose a problem, particularly reliance on health risk assessments. It's unfortunate it's not the topic of today's program. We can do a whole program on wellness. But I'm really hoping that that's an area. And this, by the way, could be done at the level of the administration. It doesn't need Congress to stick its fingers in the machine. So I keep hoping on that. Okay, again, let's stop and look where we are. The 2014 and 2015 mandates, 2013 and 14, not really a big deal. Not a lot of hue and cry over these things. People are becoming accustomed to them. It's working for the most part. Employer shared responsibility. This was the biggie, or is the biggie for employers, or at least that's the perception of the employer community. Beginning in 2014, each applicable large employer is subject to an assessable payment if at least one full-time employee is certified to receive an applicable premium tax credit or cost-sharing reduction for a public exchange. Let's put that in English. In English, what it means is, first of all, we will see that an applicable large employer is 50 or more full-time and full-time employees. So, very easy wrap about that. Most employers, I would claim the vast majority of employers, you know you're over 50 or you know you're under 50. Right? It's not, you're not going to have to do a lot of high math, you know. You don't have to haul out the old college slide rule, none of that stuff. We know what's going on. However, there will be some employers on the cusp. Oh, let me add a side note to that. For purposes of counting to 50, you've got to put all the companies under the common control. Now, those common control, if you've ever seen a 401k plan, you've seen that movie before. However, as I said, there are some employers who are on the cusp. Back in January of last year, the IRS issued a set of regulations, proposed regulations. And if you've ever seen regulations, there are 3 columns in the Federal Register, tiny little print. They go on for about 3.5 pages on telling you how to count to 50. And they do a terrific job at telling you how to count to 50. So much so that it's not like it's no good for me to sit here and repeat it. If you have that problem, you have a place to go. The steps are pretty easy to follow. You start with your full-time folks. You count under the limit of 1, that 30 or more hours per week. You'll see that. Then you take your full-time equivalents to non-full-times, figure out how to convert that to full-time, add them up, do some rounding if you have to, and you know if you're over 50 or above. On July 2, the Obama administration announced the 1-year delay. Obviously, this was controversial. My own view of this is I didn't think they needed to do that. What they could have done is they could have instead announced a good faith compliance period. Right? Good faith compliance, that's a euphemism for we'll kind of look the other way so long as you're not doing something really stupid. Okay? And I think that might have worked better, but God knows they had their own reasons. So now that's law free. So what about the 1-year delay? What are the issues? There are some transitional rules in those proposed regulations that deal with fiscal year plans. Not all of your health plans are on a calendar year, and yet this law applies on a calendar year. So these proposed rules that came out at the beginning of the year told us how to transition. We don't know what's going to happen to those transition rules. Next week I'm on a panel out in Las Vegas with Alden, who's one of the senior folks at the IRS who wrote these rules. So I'll have a chance to buttonhole and say, Alden, what are you doing with the transition rules? Come on, you can tell me. There was also a delay of the reporting rules. There were some significant reporting rules that go along with this so that the IRS can enforce the employer rules. These, and I have some slides on these toward the end, and I'll give you a preview. The one big problem with these rules is that even though we talk about the annual impact of the employer shared responsibility requirements, the law does this month by month. So therefore, reporting is going to have to show month by month. These reporting rules are tremendously annoying, but they are. And also, as I said here, the individual mandate still applies. So, what can employers do with the delay? Well, you can make no changes until the next, probably should be 2015. You can implement early. Most employers are just holding off doing what they're doing now until you get to 2015. And we don't know whether it's for plan years, for fiscal years, whether it's the 2015 plan year or January 1. Or you can drop coverage in 13 and pick it up again. I haven't seen anyone do that. Another interesting observation on the slides is this. I've not encountered any employers, and I think I can demonstrate why this is the case. We've not encountered any employers who are going to drop coverage entirely. Back in 2010, shortly after the law was enacted, there were a series of studies done by major think tanks and the big benefits consulting firms. 56% of large employers will drop coverage, or 20%, or whatever. In my opinion, all of those studies were pure nonsense. And the reason they were nonsense is we didn't have any rules to tell you how to calculate what they would cost. So therefore, how could you possibly determine if you're going to drop coverage or not if you had no idea what it's going to cost? Those surveys, in my view, were really proxies for, do you like Obamacare? And had you asked that question rather than will you drop coverage, I bet the correlation would have come 100%. So now we're seeing something a little different. Now we have the rules, people can start to dig in and understand, and what we're seeing is that employers are not dropping coverage, but there are some very interesting options. The benefits of the one-year delay, and I think there are, employers and their advisors have more time to figure this stuff out. That's really welcome. More important, the carriers, the insurance carriers, have more time to develop products. The insurance world, what we all get used to as insurance products are going to change, and they're going to change pretty substantially in some respects. If you've been in the working world for a number of years, well before 2010, we got used to either two things. Either you had coverage, and if you did, you had major medical coverage, fairly generous employer contribution, and you covered most stuff. You had some out-of-pocket stuff. Or if you were in the restaurant industry, you might have had a mini-med plan or an Aflac plan or something like that. But there was nothing in between. It was either major medical coverage or something way less. What I'm talking about here is how generous the plan is. In actuarial terms, the plans that we all are accustomed to are set at about an 85 to 92% actuary of that. What that means is that for every dollar of benefit, the plan pays 85 cents and we pay 15 out of co-pays, deductibles, co-insurance, and out-of-pockets. Okay? There will be a plan now, after post-Affordability Care Act, that pegs at 60%. And that is that is a plan that is a catastrophic coverage plan. If you have a major illness or an injury, that will get insurance coverage. But for everything else, you will be paying very high out-of-pockets, co-pays. There will be another option that employers can offer, and there will be substantially less, or hopefully substantially less premium-wise than what it costs for me to do coverage. Now, my recommendation about 2015, and I think you've already answered the question by being here, was this. About a couple of months ago, Ann Phelps, who was George Bush's senior policy advisor, she's now with EY Washington Council, did a program up in New York at Bloomberg Well headquarters, and she was talking about this issue. He said, think of, you're back in college. It's the big exam. You file into the auditorium, you're all nervous, and the professor walks in and says, folks, we're going to delay our big exam by a week. What do you do with that week? Now, obviously, some people just slip it off for a week, they don't pay attention. Others use that time to prepare. My sense is that that's what we have here. A little more time to prepare, get ready, understand the options, and come to the What was not delayed a lot, I don't think I need to read through bullet point by bullet point, but there were a lot of other features of the law that were not affected by this delay. I'm going to skip that because I want to talk about who is an applicable large employer. We talked about how counting to 50, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, other than noting that government agencies and tax exempts are in the pool here. You're not exempt from this law simply because you're a unit of government or because you're a tax exempt entity. However, sole proprietors, partners, and S Corp shareholders, principal ones, are not employees for this purpose. Surprises some folks, and it will have some effect at the lower rate of head count. We already said you've got to lump everybody together. You can't carve your company into a bunch of little companies to avoid the rule. And these are the calculations which are not going to do that. What I really want to get to is we've talked about employer shared responsibility. Payer play. What is it? How do you understand it? How many of you have been to programs like this before? How many probably are? Inevitably, at this point in the program, the speaker will say there's two options. Either you offer coverage, and here are the consequences, or you don't, and here are the penalties. That's true, but I think there's an easier way, a better way to understand it, or a better way to get it across. I claim there are three options. The first is, I'm getting out of the coverage business, I don't want to offer coverage. The penalty there, you've probably heard this before, you take all your full-time, the number of full-time folks, multiply by $2,000 annually, drop off the first 30, and you have a number. That's a non-deductible excise tax. It is usually the worst case when you're doing this analysis. And I think that's the reason why most employers are not doing this. I've not encountered any. Step two, you make an offer of coverage to all your full-time folks, but that coverage is crappy. We'll define crappy. Three, you make an offer of coverage to all your full-time folks, and the coverage is not crappy. Your penalty is 0. You say. Now the penalty for the middle one, you offer coverage but it's crappy, is $3,000 annually. But it only gets multiplied by the number of low-income folks who qualify for subsidized coverage. These folks have to fit within certain income ranges. They have to walk down to the local exchange, sign up, go through that process. And if they do, you all, as an employer, get a letter saying, your employer, such and such an employee, is qualified for a premium subsidy, and you have a chance to contest that if you think it's wrong. But at the end of the day, the penalty is $3,000, but multiplied only by the folks, the number of folks who decline your offer of coverage and go get subsidies. What coverage do you have to offer? And this is where there's an enormous amount of confusion out there about this. So let's straighten out right now. You have to offer something called minimum essential coverage. That is a misleading term. The term minimum essential coverage has nothing to do with the kind of coverage, what's in the coverage, what you cover. It instead tells you where you get the coverage, and there are some options. As an individual, by the way, in order to avoid a penalty on our personal tax return, we have to get this stuff called minimum essential coverage. And that could be Medicare, it could be Medicaid, it could be coverage under an employer group health plan. Where large employers are concerned, the law doesn't tell us what that plan has to cover. Could be very skinny, and we'll talk about skinny plans in a second, but I think this will surprise folks. If you do, so basically, right now the slide is optional. This is where you're not going to offer minimum essential coverage of any sort. You don't have an employer-sponsored health plan. Now, I'm going to talk about this penalty. So here's the assessable on option 2. We talked about the $3,000 penalty. And this is a middle ground between pay and play. You're going to offer coverage. It might not be so good, or it might be very expensive, and there are some penalties you can trigger. And then option 3 I mentioned, that's where you have the 0 penalty. What makes you get to 0? To understand how you get to 0, you have to understand what crappy coverage is. And I've done that on this next slide. I call it adequate on the slides rather than calling it crappy. I didn't want to go crappy on the slides. In order for coverage to not be crappy, it has to be both affordable and provide minimum value. Let's talk about affordability first. It's a pretty simple concept, but there are some curveballs. Coverage is affordable. If the employee premium or self-only coverage, doesn't matter if they want or need family coverage, you base it on self-only, and you ask, is it 9.5% of household income? Well, you don't know what household income is. So we'll see in the next slide that the regulators have given us some proxies here. So you can look at W-2 income, you look at the rate of pay, cents per hour, multiply dollar per hour, multiplied by hours in a month, months in a year, etc. So there are ways to get there. Affordability is a pretty simple concept aside from the safe harbors. You can use the rate of pay multiplied by 130 hours a month. The beauty of the rate of pay is you know what an employee's income is from day one. With W-2, you got to wait till the end of the year. So if you're in an industry where you have very high turnover, you're more likely to use a rate of pay. On the other hand, if you're in a more stable environment, you can get a better read on affordability using W-2. The third option is to assume everybody is at the bottom of the federal poverty line. You leave too much money on the table, essentially. So remember, we said that in order for coverage not to be crappy, it's got to be both affordable, and that means there's a certain cost to the employer, because if you can only have an employee pay 9.5% of household income, that means the employer has to make up the rest to get to affordability. Then there's the concept of minimum value. And we've talked about this a little bit before, but it's a measure of the plan's generosity, and that's the 60%. That's the 60% plan that I referred to a little bit ago. We don't have these plans yet. They're in the pipeline. We don't know what they're going to cost. But stop here and think about this for a second. Notice that in each one of these criteria, I'm talking about numbers, either percentages of income, which you know, a premium cost, which you know or you can guesstimate, which means that all of this can be plugged into a spreadsheet. You can model, based on prior year data, what offering coverage that is both affordable and provides minimum value would cost you. So how much additional would it cost the employer to drive the penalty to zero? You can know that. It's not perfect, by the way. All of the modeling software out there relies on some assumptions that we just can't nail down yet. We don't know what the take-up rate will be when you make a broad offer of coverage, given that there's an individual mandate. So we have to guess about that. So it'll take a couple of years. We talk about the learning curve of the Affordable Care Act. It's going to take a couple of years for employers to get some real-world data, plug that into the machine, and understand what their costs are. Sure.
On the household income, maybe you said this, is that based on the employee that is in your company? Because household to me means you and your spouse or whoever else lives there.
The question was, well, we've heard the household income, and that really does include folks in the whole household. As a practical matter, for purposes of these rules, and we only have a SelfPost regulations, you're really, even though these are called safe harbors, you have to use them. And here's why I think that's the case. How do you know what household income is? You can ask your employees, but A, they don't have to tell you, or if they tell you, they might lie to you. So I think as a practical matter, and until the regulators do something different in a subsequent ruling, I think we're stuck with the safe harbors. Yes, sir.
So these are fuzzy areas which lead me to think I'm going to need to have a good counselor. What kind of defense do you need to anticipate? And where is the administrative threat going to come from? Is it the IRS? Is it EEO? Is it me?
Sure, good questions. First of all, most employers that have questions about this don't go to their lawyers. They go to their benefits brokers first, benefits brokers and consultants. That is the kind of first line of defense. And we saw that in Massachusetts until penalty started being imposed. Then they couldn't talk me fast. But for now, I'm not, except for our very largest clients, or clients with particular needs, principally in the staffing industry, we're not seeing the direct way. Second, who imposes the funds? These rules are an amendment to the Internal Revenue Code. This is Treasury and IRS. As a practical matter, and I think no agency of government is immune from the political winds. The Obama administration, or any administration that is in favor of implementing this law, is not going to unnecessarily annoy employers. Let me give you an example of what I mean by that. One possible way that companies that are around, let's say 50, 60, 70 employees might respond is you might go out and get a staffing firm or a PEO and outsource 11 employees if you're 60. That will happen. I suspect that the IRS can care less about that, or you won't see enforcement efforts aimed at it necessarily. However, what if you're a company of 1,000 employees and you payroll, hire a staffing firm and offload 951? Now you've got a bullseye payment on your back. That's the kind of thing that will happen, of course. And I think similar issues coming up about capping people at 29 hours to get under the 30. Yeah, there are some legitimate ways that can be done, and there are some disastrous ways to do that. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned offering the plan, and then I'm employees declining,
Right?
are they, I didn't know that you could do that. You could decline and go to the exchange?
Yes, good question, because this is different from the way we did it in Mass. At the federal level, if you have an offer of employer coverage, you can decide, no, I don't want my employer's coverage, and I'm going to go to the exchange. If my employer offers me coverage that is both affordable and provides minimum value, I can still do it. However, when I get to the exchange, I can't get any premium subsidies, which means there can't be any penalty on the employer.
Right.
What your question also points out very well is that these different provisions of the Affordable Care Act work together. They're interconnected. Individual mandate, people must have coverage. Employer mandate, do you offer coverage? When are you eligible for a subsidy? If you're eligible for a subsidy, you trigger a penalty. All connected. Yes?
I have a question about what you said regarding employers would need a couple of years under the new system in order to determine or calculate what their costs are. They've been hoovering up this information for years. Why can't they do some analysis with a simple set of algorithms and figure it out?
Oh, I agree with you. The question was, well, my claim was it would take employers a few years to truly understand the cost. And the response was, well, gee, we've got a lot of this data. And the answer is yes. I think we can get pretty good guesstimates as to what's going on. The one thing I think we can't know until the law goes into effect is what will be the impact of the individual mandate on the take-up rate of employer coverage. And we don't know that until we get some empirical data. And so that's the one piece where I can't nail that in my model. So anyway, minimum value. Remember I said before, to drive the employer's penalty to zero, we have to offer a plan that is fairly robust. Right? It's got to have at least 60% actuarial value. The regulators have given us online calculators that will let you plug in plan terms, and you can figure out what the plan's minimum value is. And if your plan is a one-off with unique features, you can go get your local actuary certified and you meet that result. I will say this, a plan that does provide minimum value will, at a minimum, it's going to have inpatient and outpatient hospitalization. It will cover imaging. It will cover prescription drugs. And it will cover like durable medical equipment and stuff like that. The big things where the big numbers are. Now, the plans that don't do that, and we'll see an example of one in a second, will still be minimum essential coverage because they will still be employer-sponsored plan, but they will expose you to that middle level penalty. Let's see what I have. Oh, here it is. Skinny plans. This was in, the regulators refer to these as sub-minimum value plans. They made a big splash in the Wall Street Journal about a year ago. I'll give you an example of a skinny plan. This will horrify you if you've not heard of this. This is what a skinny plan covers. It covers preventative care, might have a wellness component, and if you want, you can buy an Aflac plan with it, per dollars per day to get it last. That's it. Nothing else. Horrible, isn't it? It's a sub-minimum value plan. It is still an employer-sponsored group health plan. It's still minimum essential coverage. If an employee gets one of these things, he or she does not pay a tax penalty. However, the employer is exposed to a penalty if the employee declines that coverage and goes to the exchange and gets subsidies. That is a very misunderstood feature of the law, but there are some strategies, and I think very legitimate uses of this type of plan. I'll give you one example. I keep coming back to the staffing industry because I do a lot of work in it, and it's also the industry that is an exemplar for the issues that arise under this law. We have a good-sized regional staffing firm based in somewhere not too far from here. Those cities and towns, if it's not San Diego, I don't know where it is. I have to look at the map. And they plan to offer a 60% plan, minimum value, make it affordable right across the board to their contract and temporary workers and to their in-house staff. However, there are also some rules, and we won't spend a lot of time on them today, but when one has to offer coverage to somebody that you don't know is full-time. These are called variable hour folks. As a way to hedge, in case they get that wrong, they're going to make an offer across the board of a skinny plan to everybody. So now, no matter what happens, compliance-wise, they're not going to, they've driven their penalty to zero. or as close to zero as they can get. These, when they first came out, there was an awful kind of vitriol on both sides. One side saying these are clearly abusive, the regulators will shut them down tomorrow. No, they won't, and no, they didn't. They are sub-minimum value, the statute couldn't be clearer. On the other hand, there were those who were saying, oh, these are a panacea. No, they're not. They expose an employer to the mid-level penalty, the $3,000 penalty. So they are neither the solution to everything, nor are they pure evil. They're something more. All right, big question right now. Sir?
I was just wondering on minimum value plan, you mentioned that you cover diagnostic imaging of prescription drugs. What about genome sequencing?
I think I also mentioned inpatient and outpatient hospitalization in that. Genome sequencing, I don't know enough about genome sequencing and how that fits into diagnostic and clinical care to know. I apologize. Certainly, you want to take my business card afterwards or it's on here, I can figure it out pretty quickly, but it's just, that's not really my skill set right now. Big question right now. It's fine to say we're going to make an offer of coverage to everybody, and we want it to be affordable, and we want to get the minimum value. So, Mr. Insurance Company, here's my 60% product. And the answer is we don't have one yet. Two observations. First, I can't explain it, but the carriers as a group, for a good 2.5 years, it's almost like they didn't get the memo that the Affordable Care Act passed. And it's astonishing to me that they didn't. Now, all of a sudden, they've woken up, it's like, whoa, what happened? You know, that was 2010, guys. And now they're starting to evolve these products, but there's another problem with that. If you're a major carrier and you want to offer this product nationwide, you've got to certify this with 50 state insurance commissions or however many states you operate in. And that's no mean feat. So you've got to be really careful up front about your plan design, and then you've got to submit it and go through that process. Enormously costly process and time consuming. That's why I think it's a benefit of a 1-year delay. Here is probably more pronounced than just about a year. So what do you do with those products? You will see things like, you can't have lifetime and annual limits. Another thing, and this shocked the industry. They just didn't read this in the law until somebody just rubbed their face in it. You can't, all of the old underwriting rules are now by the wayside. What the Affordable Care Act did, nationally, we talked about the national structure. They said underwriting, carriers can only underwrite based on age. You have a maximum 3 to 1 young to old in terms of variation in premium, zip code, and smoker status, and whether you have a family or individual coverage. That's it. So there's no more of this, employers got to have 50% take-up rate by their employee to go right. No more of this, the employer's got to contribute at least 50% of the premium. All of that's gone. They didn't believe it. For months, they just didn't believe it until it finally showed up in the preamble to a final regulation. The regulators had to put it black and white for them to see it. So those products, but now we're starting to see them in the pipeline. And here's what they might look like. Obviously, high co-pays, deductibles. There's a cap on out-of-pocket maximums. So you can't go too far with this stuff. However, there will be things like this. You can't have more than 3 infertility treatments in a year or a lifetime or something like that. That's not an annual or lifetime limit on cost. It's number of procedures. There will be things like that. These plans are now in their nascent developing stages. We can start to see more of them coming out. I've got one on my desk right now where carriers asked us for an opinion of, does this work? Does this, yeah, I mean, it does. I'm going to tell them how to get back on my desk one of these days to do that. But these are coming in the pipeline. And I think as employers, you will start to see your brokers and consultants will start telling you about these things. There are also 2 other things I will mention. There's a strategy of self-funding even small plans that relies on collecting a group of small employers and then going out and getting reinsurance for stop loss, a ban of reinsurance. And it's really, it's called renting the capital, you reform the capital. And then there's a high level of stop loss. It's a fairly complex system, but here's what will, particularly in San Diego, in the types of companies that you saw posted on this board, which tend to have fairly good experience, if you can find 5, 10, 15, 20 of those types of companies, all with good profiles, and you can have each one of them with its own self-funded plan with these 2 layers of stop loss, you could drive your premium down, way down, relative to going into the small group market when the premiums are going to jump up substantially. And the reason is that under the Affordable Care Act, in the individual and small group market, there are 10 categories of coverage you must have in the plan. And also, as a small employer, and this is a rough analogy to get the idea, essentially what happens is a small employer, under 100 in 2016 and beyond, you're buying retail, whereas your large company counterparts are buying wholesale. The other arrangement I've seen, and this has been, in fact, we do have a PEO representative. Isn't Derek was here? Oh, you are. Right. Because I don't know if you folks have seen this, but PEOs are starting to do this sort of structure, but facilitating the model that I just mentioned. Or they're doing it with a carrier. They're going out and getting a carrier, band together a bunch of clients, and write the coverage under something called a multiple employer welfare arrangement. The one problem I see with that, and I don't know how folks are getting around it, is most states have laws. Thank you very much. The one problem with that is most states say that you can't put together a bunch of small groups to make one big group. And it seems to be happening everywhere. That's what I want to say about that. The next few slides, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this today because it gets fairly into the weeds, but there is a set of rules that were in the proposed regulations issued in January of this year that answer this question. Yeah, it's great. I know I have to cover full-time. I know I don't have to cover full-time. What happens if when I hire somebody, I have no clue if they're a full-time employee? You're a restaurant at a seaside resort. You hire a bartender the week before 4th of July. 4th of July is beautiful, sunny, and everything's crowded. The bartenders are working 80 hours a week for 2 weeks. Then everybody goes home and it rains. Now your bartender's down to 20 hours. Is that a full-time employee? There's a whole set of rules dealing with the look-back measurement period, your reference to, that help you answer those questions. The basic premise of this is the IRS gives you a time up to a full year. You don't have to offer coverage, you won't be penalized. And you get to look and see, is this person full-time? At the end of that period, if you determine they are, then you cover them for a like period irrespective of their hours. So that's the trade-off. You get a year off, you take a look, but they are full-time, you give them coverage irrespective of hours, so long as they're employed. Again, I'm not going to look through that. I'm going to skip these slides and go to, I'm going to talk about notices, and I also want to talk a little bit about the political environment, because I think that's important. Last October, we had a requirement to provide notices to employees, just telling them about public exchanges. The volume of calls from our clients in this was insane, and folks were really, really worried about it. Early on, our firm puts out client advisories from time to time on this stuff. I said in there, why is everybody so worried about this? There's no penalty for not giving these notices. Not to say it's a good idea simply to skip it, but there's no penalty, so don't get so nervous about it. Well, a week later, the Department of Labor came out with its own set of FAQs and said, yeah, that's right. So here's my point about that. The big questions we had is, well, can you provide this by payroll supplements, for example? Yes, you can. Can you provide them electronically? This question, by the way, we were having a long, detailed seminar about this. We talked a lot about the particulars of electronic safe harbors. Forget it. You can provide it electronically. I said so. I do want to leave some time for Q&A, but I'd like to turn now to the one other substantive item on consumer good health care and the political angles. Up until there's obviously a movement in this country toward pure consumer-driven healthcare. The ideal model is something like this. Employer provides a sum of money, a couple of $1,000s. Employee can go anywhere in the individual market and buy coverage. In an ideal form of this, for the proponents of consumer-driven healthcare, ultimately they would like the employees to be able to go anywhere in the country, across state lines, to buy coverage. In a notice that came out a few weeks ago, the regulators shut this down completely. You cannot use employer money on a pre-tax basis to purchase coverage in the individual market. Period, paragraph, end of discussion. They are even after this guidance, which couldn't be clearer in my view. This was a piece of guidance, by the way. It came out on Friday afternoon, way too wonky for Friday afternoon. But there are still, at least I think, one carrier out there that is saying, oh, no, our product is different. No, it's not. It doesn't work. Stop it. So now, by the way, from a policy perspective, would that be a good idea? It may very well be. The news right now, from a legal perspective, is you can't do that. What you can do is you can create a consumer-driven product that looks very much like that accesses group market products. That is called a private exchange. You'll see, you'll hear talk about private exchanges and information about them. There's no agreed upon accepted definition, but I think what most people think it will look like is your 401k plan, where you have this, you can pick investments from different carriers, different platforms, and they all get lumped into one. So instead of being confined to just say Blue Cross Blue Shield, in your health plan you can pick a Blue Cross product, you can pick a Kaiser product. I don't want to quite work that way here. You get the idea. You wouldn't be confined to one company. Private exchanges, God knows how that arc is going to go. These things might be the best thing to go down the pike in a while, but there is an administrative drag on them, and it's not clear to me where the cost savings comes from yet. But just because it's not clear to me doesn't mean the cost savings are not clear. My last set of substantive comments, I don't even know if I have a slide, maybe I do. Okay. This is the obvious stuff. We know there's a partisan divide in this country that is a huge distraction to employers and movements. And although we don't get the question very often, every once in a while I say, well, is this going to go away or is this going to change? So I'm going to make this claim. It's not going to go away, but for a different reason than perhaps you've ever heard. The key constituencies that drove the enactment of the Affordable Care Act are three. Number one, the carriers were salivating, the insurance carriers were salivating over 30 million new covered lives. Number two, the providers, pretty much the same sort of thing. A lot of new coverage, not as much uncompensated care. And three, what I call loosely the Medicare and Medicaid infrastructure. Recall that Medicare and Medicaid are half of the $2.6 trillion that we spend annually on healthcare. There's a lot of money in that system that those winners want to ensure continues to flow. That political dynamic is still in place. It has not changed. I hate to say it to you this way, but employers aren't going to kill. What employers think about this and job creation at the margins is irrelevant to the larger political picture. And that is what drove this originally, and that's why it has had such state. That said, there are a couple of cases heading to the Supreme Court right now that could blow a major hole in Obamacare's hull, as I like to say. And that's this. Recall we talked about premium subsidies. There is a drafting error in Section 36B of the Internal Revenue Code. What it says is, an individual, low-income individual, may qualify for premium tax subsidies through through an exchange established by a state. That's what I just said. Through an exchange established, but you know what? About 30-something states have established exchange, they're running on the federal exchange. And the claim is that the IRS, when writing rules under that provision of the Internal Revenue Code, that allowed folks to get subsidies in a federally facilitated exchange is illegal. The IRS exceeded its authority under the statute. So that's the argument. Now, the counter-argument is there are many references elsewhere in the Affordable Care Act that make it clear that Congress didn't intend that, or appear to make it clear that Congress didn't intend that. So the narrow question heading to the Supreme Court is, did the IRS exceed its authority? Federal agencies traditionally have been granted an enormous amount of deference when they make a rule. So the plaintiffs in this case have a high bar to climb over. But if they succeed, that means there will be no premium subsidies in 30-something states. So that means that folks won't be able to afford coverage, and you won't cover folks and go back to the system.
And that implies that there can be no mid-tier penalty, right?
Oh, that's good. Yes, thank you. Yes, that too. In those states that employers couldn't be penalized. So think of the revenue right there as well. Sorry, I missed that. Thank you. All right, I've rattled on for a little more than an hour. Thankfully, nobody's got their head down in the chair in front of them. I appreciate that. I'd be more than happy to take questions now, and I'll be around during for a little bit or all day. Yes, sir.
Follow up on what you just talked about on that lawsuit,
Yep.
which recently got a boost by not being thrown out. What's your opinion?
Here's my opinion. And by the way, I've studied this pretty carefully. If this were being judged purely on legal merit, I think the IRS would be sustained. Treasury and IRS would be sustained. I think the presumption that an agency's rule is good is such a strong presumption that it would be sustained. But I want to caution that once you get to the Supreme Court, almost nothing is decided on purely legal grounds. I mean, the case last year with the individual mandate, I mean, that case, basically what happened, you had the Chief Justice who had a particular very long-term agenda that had nothing to do with the Affordable Care Act. And basically that decision was in the context of his long-term political judicial agenda dealing with the Commerce Clause, clawing back the reach of the Commerce Clause. And so he did that in his opinion, but then ground the opinion on the taxing power, for example. So who knows what will happen when it gets to the Supreme Court. But I still handicap it about 60-40 sustained. Else? Yes.
You had mentioned earlier that, to determine if a new employee is full-time or not, you have a year look-back period. What about existing employees? Do you look at the monthly average or the annual average of their hours?
Yeah, the question was, I alluded to, I really didn't talk much about the look-back measurement curve. There are parallel rules for what are called ongoing employees. We have the same sort of thing. You could test your ongoing employees with something called a standard measurement period, year by year. And if they are full-time this year, they get coverage next. If they don't, then they skip a year. You could do that. Most employers, I think the mindset is, we have this group of employees that at least in our mind are full-time. And therefore, we're going to give them coverage. And, yeah, if hours slip or not, we don't care. But you could do that. Sir?
Can we make the slides available?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we're going to somehow hook it up so these folks can get the slides.
Sure. Why don't you give us your card information? We'll make sure we send you a copy of the slide electronically.
Also, I think my contact information is at the end of somewhere. No, I certainly don't want. Oops, sorry. Pick up the phone, call me. Yes.
Some of your slides mentioned rules applying to the flexible spending accounts. Do those also apply to the health safety accounts that are part of like a health savings plan?
Yeah, the question was, I mentioned a cap on health flexible spending accounts, and employee elected referrals at $2,500. Those rules do not apply to health reimbursement accounts. The employer could establish particularly a high deductible health plan and have an HRA underneath to pick up, whatever, and that's fine.
Right.
So it's only a cap on elected, salary elected referrals. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Yeah, so you briefly touched on wellness program. They may play some part on decision making. So if there's an emergent program, so for example, my company maybe work on a wellness program, but we are small. what would you suggest if we want to somehow participate or help participate in the program? I don't know, go to insurance or go to these policymakers?
The question had to do with wellness programs. I fear I might have painted perhaps a little bit too dismal a picture. We do have some recent rules that tell us how the IRS and the Department of Labor view wellness programs and how you should implement them. There are a good number of standalone wellness providers, third-party providers, that will give you a wellness package, and they will handle it all, so you don't see anything in terms of information, which is terrific. And most of those, which you should be able to access through your benefits consultants and advisors if you have them, are pretty reliable. And so for now, I think it's pretty safe to use those products and not worry too much about them. But changes are coming, and I hope changes are coming for the good. Particularly the ability to use these things called health risk assessments to determine is somebody at risk for diabetes or heart attack, and to anticipate that. It's tricky to do that right now. Anyone else? Going once? Sir?
You talked about the 5 kind of main components that were here in Massachusetts to this one. One of them was the state product. How did it perform, and is it, with the tax subsidies coming from tax revenue? It seems like a lot of people are going to, that have pre-existing conditions will go get a plan and then get their services done and then either consider dropping or not paying into it later. Yeah.
I got, well, first of all, 3 answers to that, all of them somewhat compatible. The first is, in some audiences, I get a question similar to that about Massachusetts, and if you're an opponent of the Affordable Care Act, my answer will drive you crazy, but I'm on the ground on pretty safe footing with this. In Mass, I would claim our healthcare reform law is an unparalleled success. Now, what people come back with, well, gee, your costs went up. No kidding. When we started out in 2006, we never sought to control costs, we sought to expand coverage. Cost was deferred. However, you do make a good point. It is possible that the state-based exchanges become dumping grounds for the worst risk. The only way you prevent that is by expanding the pool, getting the young, healthier folks in that pool, so you spread the risk. I think the jury's out there. I think you point to a very important and risky component of healthcare. In Mass, it has not happened. And I can't tell you why. I just don't know. It's not that I know. I can tell you, it's just I don't know. Yes, ma'am.
Have you proposed legislation for improving the actual penalty to improve the uptake level?
Yeah, who? Talk about a political bond. I mean, that was a highly contentious feature of the act when we were going through at the federal level. And that was one of the topics in my testimony before the Senate Finance Committee. We went round and round on that. I think the person who beat me up the most in that hearing was my own state senator, John Short. Great. Let it go, man. But yeah, what are you going to? Could you imagine a bill submitted to the House of Representatives tomorrow, driving with tripling the individual penalty? You couldn't get one sponsor for it. That's what I mean.
So it's totally impossible.
Yeah, I think it's impossible.
But it is going up, right?
Well, what happens is, structurally, Mitch is right. It's $95 in the first year, and it phases in and caps out at 2.5% of household income. Anyone else? Going once, going twice. We're done. Thank you so much. And
as a reminder, if you